2 years complete and 3 years we are now into this pandemic, Sheikh. Just as a warm-up, if you were to hone down on one key spiritual lesson that perhaps we can take with us from this experience, what would that be, or more than one?
I suppose the useful reminder of our fragility. Death is described somewhat surprisingly in a hadith as tuhfatul mu'min, the precious gift to the believer. The believer has confidence in Allah and trusts that he is passing on to God's merciful hands, shouldn't fear. But also for those around him or her, a useful reminder that we're all passing through that same road, and that we need to live in a more intense and coloured and attentive way in this age of distraction and multiple confusions, that we need to focus on the miracle of the moment. It said that all moments are equally astonishing. We sometimes tend to wait through what we tend to assume are mediocre times, looking for the next sudden thrill of excitement. But in fact, every moment is equivalently a divine gift and has its own rightness and its own specialness, whether it be a sweet or a bitter moment. And we need to engage much more, I think, with the time and the place rather than with our dreams.
Inshallah. We welcome both of them as messengers, the sweet or otherwise. Alhamdulillah. Your book, Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad, Traveling Home, is a collection of essays about Islam in Europe. It takes us through a plethora of issues, from migration to the environment, to anger, to Islamic economics, and to that of identity, and many other such pertinent contemporary issues. Yet its approach is not sociological, and nor does it claim to lay out a blueprint on how to negotiate between some of these larger or bigger themes. Now, it is rather a theological one. I suppose the title is quite apt, Traveling Home. I was curious on how you settled with that title.
Well, partly it tries to make the rather obvious point that, as the hadith says, the whole earth has been made a mosque for me. جُعِلَتْ لِي الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا. And the hadith in which the Holy Prophet ﷺ says that he is sent to all mankind, which means that wherever the believer is, that is his home. We are not part of a diaspora, we are not exiled, although sometimes the first generation of migrant Muslims in the West can feel that they are part of some kind of diaspora or in a rather strange and fractured relationship with the land under their feet. But Islam is universal. It is the final religion. It is the religion that purports to be for every place, and there is a way of being distinctively and 100% authentically Islamic wherever you happen to be, whether it be in Cambridge or in Bankstown or wherever. Muslims are never really exiles, except insofar as, this is the other meaning of the title really, we are exiles from our creator and traveling back to him, and he is the true homeland. As one of the poets says, وَمَا هَذِهِ الدُّنْيَا بِدَارِ إِقَامَةٍ وَإِنْ هِيَ إِلَّا كَالطَّرِيقِ إِلَى الْوَطَنِ. This world is not a place to stay, it's just a road back to the homeland. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our source, al-mabda', and our place of return, ma'ad. So in a sense, we're all exiled from him. We forget the time when we said Bala Shahidna at the time of the first covenant. We're all nostalgic for our divine home, for the abode where alone there is peace and protection and perfection and appropriateness. We're in this world with its thorns, and it doesn't quite feel like home to us. We feel that we are spiritual exiles, even if we are physically and culturally at home. So I suppose it has those two main meanings.
MashaAllah. Travel is indeed. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, Sheikh. Whilst browsing through Cambridge Muslim colleges, CMC's center, I came across on website the Center for Study of Existential Risk at the university. And this was quite actually new and piqued my personal intrigue. I guess our conversation today, I suppose, will be premised against this primary question that I heard yourself in one of your talks state. What does it mean to be a Muslim in the context of the collapse of the Western meta-narratives? And so perhaps we can begin here our discussion on the book. How would you unpack such a context that of the Western narrative for us?
Well, that's a big story, isn't it? The West has had, until living memory, a very clear sense of itself as being the manifest destiny of history, and everything else, as one American politician said, being the roadkill of history, a kind of hard Darwinian survival of the fittest view. And it is the white Anglo-Saxon who, on this view, won that millennial race. Supposed to be evidenced by forms of government, military prowess, new technologies, capacities for making the desert bloom, etc., etc. That's triumphalism, which left many Muslims feeling wrong-footed, either envious or angry or confused or demoralized. Not just Muslims, but representatives of other surviving civilizations as well, now seems to have run into the buffers in the form of the effective but really unexpected terminus of many of the West's narratives, the rise of the deconstruction of consciousness, which is meant to be the basis of human subjectivity and therefore of the sovereign Western Enlightenment will, by the neuroscientists, many of whom are saying that, well, consciousness is a kind of illusory ghost, and in fact, we are automated and there is no such thing as consciousness. That's a very complex issue, and I haven't been able to go into it in detail in the book, but clearly it spells death to the romantic idea of the hero, the West, forging forwards into a glorious future. Other collapses have been, of course, the destruction of traditional metaphysics in the West, thanks to postmodernism and the Kantian turn. The fact that philosophy, at least in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, seems to be little more than juggling with linguistic arguments and logical cruxes, and has failed to answer all of the questions that it set out to answer back in the days of Plato and Aristotle. So the collapse of the classical philosophical project is another example of how the West has unexpectedly crippled itself. Another, of course, is the vaunted Enlightenment claim that through human instrumentality and the mastery of science, we would be able to turn all of nature into our slave and our servant, thereby enriching and benefiting ourselves and prolonging our own comforts and our lifespans. And we can now see, and this is really what our centre at the University of Cambridge for the study of existential risks exists to explore, has now collapsed, or at least been very severely undermined by the climate change, most obviously, the collapse in the ecosystem, our life support system, which is something that the Glasgow conference didn't really resolve, that the Paris conference didn't really resolve, and that runs up absolutely and directly against the capitalistic and mad scientist worldview, which propels humanity into this mad model of endless growth. But it's not just a question of climate change challenging that triumphalism, but also a question of other scientific threats, nanotechnology, for instance, the so-called grey goo scenario, which some scientists are afraid of, whereby microscopic machines will simply take over all the matter of the planet and reduce everything into a replica of those tiny machines. Many nanotechnologists are furrowing their brows and working out how they can avoid that nightmare scenario. The by now fairly familiar scenario of some kind of nuclear catastrophe, either through some particle experiment going wrong, nuclear fusion getting out of control, or the traditional exchange of nuclear warheads. And of course, everybody is currently anxious about the situation in Eastern Europe with Ukraine and the Russians. And so many other ways in which science, instrumentalized to maximize human comfort, is now proliferating the possible sources of our own demise, which means that the old triumphalist narrative of science, and incidentally a lot of rather naive Muslim narratives that say Islam, the religion of science, Islam, the religion of progress, Islam, the religion that really triggered the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, all of that rather apologetic, self-defeating claptrap now no longer really has a place, because science is increasingly presenting itself as the great threat to humanity rather than the great purveyor of greater knowledge and comfort. So it's very much a time of the end of the old triumphalist narrative. But what replaces it is the large question for everyone. Postmodernism is not really an alternative, it's just an end to all of the alternatives. And we're moving into a kind of vacuum at the moment, floating around. And I do propose that some of the few certainties that Western humanity retains are no longer those relating to the spirit, which is let go of many years ago by most of them, nor yet the mind, because of the demise of classical philosophy, but simply the body. So the great orthodoxies, obsessions, campaigns, phobias, taboos, idealisms of the modern secular world are all to do with the body, about race, about desire, about orientations, about things to do with the body. And many of those are rooted in human sufferings that genuinely do need to be heard and addressed. But nonetheless, it's very odd that this civilization, which set its sights on a final explanation of everything, is now reduced in terms of its serious passions and campaigns to dealing with the body and how it looks, how it desires, how it feels itself to be, which is, by all traditional standards, the lowest thing to be concerned with, because the body is beneath the mind, which is beneath the spirit. All traditional cultures have that hierarchy. But now the body alone is left, and it remains to be seen how satisfying that will be as the basis for the passions of a civilization and a culture in the longer term.
Intriguing indeed. When you were describing your book, you stated that it is like the style of your writing is a bit more like an ishara, or is elusive or indicative. Your ishara in these essays in Traveling Home, Sheikh, presents these theological intersections within Islam that qualifies that intrinsic, you're referring to that vacuum, that intrinsic capacity that Islam has on offer on as continuing spiritual, ethical, and moral value propositions in the face of these perennial challenges that you just outlined. And that the guiding narrative is that traditional Islam paradigm. I guess, what does traditional Islam mean to you, and how does it sit with the postmodern narratives you touched on, an era where relative truths, and again, you touched on that subjectivity and individuality that is in pursuit of validation, is becoming our new norm? I suppose, especially when I speak to youth, there is this tension between traditionalism and these subjective truths, fueled sometimes with this loss of trust or confidence, even in scholarship or authority. So, with that of the absolute truth. So, how do you see traditional Islam?
Well, that's another tricky question. And I try to indicate that I'm using the word necessarily in a rather vague sense. I suppose it could be loosely defined as that conviction, which I think is shared by traditional ulama around the world, which is that Islam comes equipped with certain very emphatic styles of maintaining lines of transmission. In the Hadith, famously, it's the isnad system, which other religions, with the partial exception of some ancient Hindu texts, really never developed. There's no isnad for the Gospel of St. John, for instance. It would be great if we had it, but there's a gap between the writing and the composition. Whereas the Muslims, really from the earliest time, insisted on tradition in the original sense of traditio, handing on, in ways that were absolutely forensically scrutinized, criticized, and validated. And that's not just the case with the Hadith, but the transmission of the Quran, which of course is by tawatur, and we know exactly through whom it came down. And some of my teachers in the Middle East had the Musalsal Hadith, which is I found it quite a mind-blowing phenomenon. I'd be sitting around with these mostly Syrian students in Mecca, and the teacher would be sitting there and would be reading from Sahih Muslim, the Hadith collection, and discussing the isnads in the printed edition of the text that we had. And then a student would say to the Sheikh, "Have you got your own isnad for this Hadith?" And then to my amazement, the Sheikh would kind of sit back and close his eyes and say, "Haddathani al-Walid rahimahullah an al-Sheikh fulan," and so forth, and name about 30 different names going back to the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for these hadiths. That skill, of course, because it requires an eidetic type of memory, is becoming unusual in the Ummah. But no other community can do that. So we are intrinsically traditional in that we make sure that there is a living, verified mediation for everything that we have going back to the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And printed books and manuscripts are kind of an aid, and it's nice to have them, but they're not the real Islam. And in this, I think Islam shows some aspect of its primordiality, because pre-literate ancient peoples had tremendous memories, and they also would narrate lineages, not just of human beings, of mythological figures, of their horses and so forth. It's really part of a human need to feel that one's identity is shaped by being part of a living tradition, that you've taken the hand of somebody who took the hand of someone, who took the hand of someone, and it goes back to the prophetic hand. So intrinsically, Islam is a religion of traditio, and this is really insisted on by the scholars, that you can only study any text of Islam with somebody who's been authorized to teach it, by somebody who's authorized to teach it back to the author of that text. And nowadays, just Googling things online is the exact opposite of that, and that leads to all kinds of aberrations and a sense of kind of disconnectedness. But the traditional way of the ulama is clear. So that, in a sense, is my definition of what traditional Islam is. It's what's been handed on, but also the accumulated wisdom of the ummah. The ulama have not been foolish or unconscientious. And whenever new issues arise, as the world changes, they explain how these transformations are to be understood on the basis of the deposit of faith. And that continues until the present. So to be part of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of the Sunnah and the congregation, is not to be just part of the people who follow the Sunnah in the congregation of Muslims today, but in the past, in communion, as it were, with the ulama of the past, and benefiting from the cumulative wisdom of the Muslim centuries. The alternatives to that are simply looking it up for yourself and not paying attention to the accumulated wisdom of the ummah. And that sometimes leads to forms of heretical strangeness, or it leads sometimes to extremism. People who say they don't care about the ulama and the ijma' of the scholars, they just want to use their own anger to interpret the Quran and the Hadith, and that always leads to catastrophe. But alhamdulillah, we have the tradition intact. Our form of worship is, we believe, the form of the founders' worship, and so it is with all of our other institutions. So in this age of postmodern fragmentation and confusion, and a lot of mental health issues that come from that, as people really don't feel rooted in anything, we have this lifeboat, which is the Sunnah, which gives us a form of life, which is primordial, which is natural, which is traditional, which is sacred, but which is reliably transmitted by our ulama. So that's the great gift of Islam, that you can't go into the place of worship of other religions, by and large, and see people worshipping as the founder of that religion worshipped and wished people to worship. Go into a mosque just about anywhere in the world, and whatever else the people may be disputing, generally the form of worship throughout the ummah in our 10 million or so mosques is the same. And that's a tremendous gift. And I think that's one reason that draws many people into Islam, because it gives you a very firm place to be, a lifeboat in the increasingly stormy and threatening seas of modernity and post-modernity.
Sure. Almost like a civilization of sanad there, right at our fingertips. In the introduction chapter of your book, Sheikh, you mentioned, and I quote, you quoted actually, universal truth is worth more than local particularisms. And that there is, I particularly like this, nobility in Abrahamic mobility. And you contend in that chapter that Muslims, as you alluded at the beginning, find their home everywhere, for Islam is intrinsically a portable religion with strong historic culture of migration. And this universalism enables the local rooting of Islam for, and you quoted the Quran there, chapter 3, verse 115, wheresoever you may turn, there is God's face. Now, what piqued my interest in this chapter was the term Ishmaelite theology. Now, how does Ishmael fit in this picture, Sheikh, pun intended?
Okay. Well, we know that Islam is not the religion of either or, the binaries of a certain type of Christianity that assumes that history is given meaning only by one transformative, pivotal moment in history, but it's the religion of both and. The jami', inclusive nature of Islam, means that not just do we have a number of madahib and schools of aqidah and who knows how many Sufi tariqas, but we also have an inclusive attitude to all of the prophets, لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله. We make no distinction between any of God's messengers. And that's one of the special qualities of the Muslim. وَلِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ هَادٍ. For every nation there has been a guide because of God's love and compassion. There can't be just one, but there have to be a plurality of divine messengers. So on the basis of this, we look at the Abraham story as a paradigm. For the biblical authors, the two sons of Abraham, Ishaq and Ismail, represent conflictual principles. You know the story that Ismail is the firstborn, and evidently he is the heir to the covenant and the promise. And then unexpectedly, Sarah gives birth at a great age to Ishaq. And then the authors of the Genesis text, post-exilic authors, obviously hundreds of years after the purported events, say, oh no, Ismail was a kind of false start, but Ishaq is where the true covenant will be, the people, and also the messianic event. And Ismail is the wild man sent out into the wilderness, and the Ishmaelite becomes a kind of paradigm for unchosenness. Why? Because he's ethnically impure. He's half Egyptian because his mother Hajar is from Egypt and not of what becomes the Israelite line. So the great polarity in the eyes of the Bible authors between the people and Egypt is figured in this. And then the story doesn't end with Ismail wandering off into the desert and the Bible having no further interest in him, but in Islam finds its consummation. The Holy Prophet ﷺ is of the line of the Bani Ismail and is the vindication not of a binary principle, either or, but of an inclusive principle, both and, because not only do we accept the Ishmaelite line, but we also accept the prophets that come from Ishaq alayhi salam. And of course, alone amongst the religions, apart from Christianity, we recognize Sayyidina Isa, Christ, as the true Messiah, born of a virgin. So there's an inclusivity about the way in which the Quran, as it were, repairs and repristinates the Abrahamic story that makes us naturally hopeful migrants. Even Ismail, with his mother, go off into the desert with a crock of water, and there seems to be no hope. But by God's providence, there is the well of Zamzam, there is the miracle of the valley of Mecca, and we revisit that whenever we make our Umrah and our Hajj, in order to affirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tends to be with the outcast, with the rejected, with the asylum seeker, with the refugee, with the ethnically mixed and impure. God tends to be with those margins. And that's exactly the symbol of Ishmael. And the final vindication of Ishmael and the ethnic hybridity and rejected status, which the Genesis authors have constructed, comes with the rise of Islam. So as Ishmaelite people, we are people who include the African principle. We are people who include respect for the single woman, the strong woman, the mother who goes out into the desert but is strong and vindicated. We respect the principle of universality of the Gentile. So it's the inclusive principle. The Ishmaelite religion is the one that has had this enormous coalition of nations underneath its belt. The traditional pre-modern Ummah from Senegal to Sumatra had so many different colors and cultures as part of its reality. And that's what it is to be part of the ecumenical community of Islam, the vindication of the marginalized, of the ethnically problematic, of the exiled, with whom ultimately is God's favor.
Sure. And with God's favor in this world, like as we navigate, should the psychology, the collective psychology, be that of, is there a tension between that marginal historic context and our integration into mainstream society? Or are we all always expected to stay at that sort of marginal? Is there any implications of that understanding, if that made sense?
Well, the marginality, which is just a fact, Islamophobia or whatever you wish to call it, represents Muslims as the most problematic community globally and the most problematic community nationally in just about every country in the world where Muslims are a minority, not just in Europe, but also in China, in India, in anywhere you care to name. There is a problem. based on this stigmatizing of the Ishmaelite identity. That doesn't, however, mean that we are to be ghettoized, live in encampments outside the cities, nurture a sense of victimization and hopelessness, because the point of the Ishmaelite principle is that there is a vindication, finally. وَنَجْعَلَهُمُ الْوَارِثِينَ. Those who are weak in the earth shall be made the inheritors. We're optimistic about the situation, and we believe, therefore, that we should be positively engaging in everybody's political and civic structures wherever we can, partly because that's necessary for opening the doors of da'wah, but partly also because we have a reparative responsibility. Wherever we go, we should be a people of upliftment. These societies are hurting, they've lost their own religion, their family life is in disarray, their technology is poisoning the planet. It's the function of God's people in this age to directly and reparatively and compassionately try and fix the mess that modernity is in, rather than sitting back and feeling sorry for ourselves. And I think that's the prophetic ethos, and it's something that really has to galvanize us to get involved, not because we want everybody to like us, that may never happen, but because it's our responsibility to help them.
We will touch on that responsibility and the how to helping part shortly. Sheikh, thanks for shedding light on that ethos. Continuing from there, how do you see the need for a proper understanding of Islamic theology and its relevance to our current context, particularly amongst our youth? Is the lack, I suppose, for pursuing traditional kalam or theology perhaps a major hindrance, in your view, to that of Tawheed-centeredness? How important is Islamic theology?
Well, theology, insofar as it deals with the most fundamental questions that people have about God, is the most important thing. The existence of God, the nature of creation, the nature of time, the source of ethics, the problem of evil, the end of the world. These are the big questions. And rather than thinking about them impressionistically on the basis of what you heard from your mother at the kitchen sink when you were 10 years old, people need to rigorously investigate these things and sort out, the coherent way of explaining them and interpreting them. And unfortunately, in the turn to a kind of emotive literalism that we've seen in a lot of Muslim societies recently, the cultivation of logic, which is the basis for any reasoned religious discourse, has been lost. Logic was always the first thing that you studied in a traditional madrasa. Logic, logic, logic. It's very dusty and difficult, but in order to construct a good argument, in fiqh as well as in doctrine, you have to know what a good argument is and differentiate it from a false one. And there's too many bad arguments amongst the Muslims nowadays, just driven by fearfulness, driven by emotion, driven by sectarianism, and that's not going to have a good outcome. But logic, reason, based on mathematics, really, something you can't really deny, it's neutral. And the great scholars of Islam historically, from Imam Ghazali to Fakhruddin Razi to whoever, have insisted on the primacy of logic, and therefore on the primacy of developing the very complex, nuanced classical kalam arguments for the truths of our religion. And this is an age in which the truths of religion are regularly derided or rejected or misunderstood. And we can't just deal with the new atheists by throwing hadiths at them because they don't accept the authority of the hadiths. We have to use solid, substantial arguments. And alhamdulillah, the kind of arguments that seem to have pulled the carpet from beneath Christianity in the West don't really apply when set up against the very different philosophical system of Muslim thought. We deal with the problem of creation, we deal with the problem of ethics, we certainly deal with the problem of evil very compendiously. But unfortunately, a lot of Muslims simply don't know the classical arguments because they're too busy getting into something else. So there's no shortcut, really. This is about belief, it's about iman, and we have to have as solid a basis for it as we possibly can.
An investigative faith, tahqiqi iman.
Yeah.
In the same chapter, you outlined two contemporary Muslim weaknesses that needs to be rejected by traditional Islam: reactive identity religion with a desire for revenge that is driven by ego, and secondly, a declining reference to the presence, power, and compassion of God. Now, an extension from these, I suppose my question is, do you see Muslims in the West falling into, I guess, identity politics? And if so, how does that sit with the prophetic ways? And how far would the spiritual consequence of such a focus be on our communities and on our ummah?
Well, sometimes Muslims in their anxiety look for people they can work with to deal with the various issues that they face as a marginalized community. And sometimes they fall in with the wrong company. They fall in with people whose basic worldview is simply inimical to religion, or they may adopt an essentially sociological and therefore secularizing interpretation, assuming that problems and solutions can be determined without reference to transcendence, which means that it can't be Islamic, because Islam, the Quran are very emphatically about the sole agency of God in history. And the sociologists have failed predictively so many times. 50 years ago, how many sociologists were predicting the collapse of communism, for instance? How many were predicting the rise of global Islamic fundamentalism? It's not really a social science. It's just a fashionable way of generating jargon that gets academics tenure, but it doesn't really have any claim to being a science. So instead of getting into bed with those people, I think we need to be dealing with still not inconsiderable residue of Christian, Jewish, and other religious thought in the West, where people still are in the habit of looking for God's grace, providence, for being hopeful on that basis, and having a sacred view of how history is unfolding. I find it very strange that Muslims are jumping on woke and other bandwagons, even though those bandwagons come out of an Enlightenment narrative that is virulently and specifically anti the idea of religion and revelation, and ignoring the poor old bishops, Christian theologians, and others who certainly disagree with us fundamentally on a number of doctrinal issues, but still are part of the broad family of Ahl al-Kitab and faith in God, and can hear us when we want to voice ideas that are not purely political, communitarian, grievance-based, and sociological. So I think we found the wrong partners, really. We should be teaming up with the Ahl al-Kitab, not with social justice warriors of various kinds whose roots ultimately are in Marxism, and therefore in a principle that is, from our point of view, dark and anti-religious.
Interesting, you mentioned on Ahl al-Kitab, your chapter 8, a theology of the Ahl al-Kitab. I found it quite interesting, and in lieu of time, we have a lot of questions, Sheikh, but I'll soon open the floor as well for the audience to engage. Now, in that chapter, I almost found it poetic because there's also references to Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi's work, Sadi. And in particular, you mentioned this one, and I quote the English translation: "I'm delighted in the world because the world is delighted in him. I love every world, for every world is from him." I had come across Yunus Emre's big quote that we love the creation because of the creator. It just resonated strongly there. Now, what also brought smile to the heart is when you quoted, "To claim to be a Muslim and not walk around in a world with a sense of wonder, a smile and kindness bubbling over everyone you see is to lie." It can be a tough challenge for some. My question here is for faith, and you asserted this, for faith to prevail over its alternatives, it must not be veiled by strangeness, as you were referring to culture and custom and the local urf or custom. So what are the problems that you see in how these two are unfolding in the Western world, or how are we moving forward with those considerations?
Well, yeah, there's several questions there. I mean, the Saadi quote, "Jahan Khurram as Anon, ke Jahan Khurram as Ost," represents what was universally the pre-modern style of being Muslim, which was joyful, which was love-based, which was open, optimistic, and had nothing to do with this kind of creeping around feeling anxious and resentful, which is the state of a lot of Muslims today, especially in our inner cities. We need to get back to that ethos of our poetry, when the Muslims were singing of delight in the world. They weren't saying, "Oh, the politics is so wonderful, the economy is so strong." They were singing, "The world is God's world. In everything I can see a shahid, a witness to his presence, to his wisdom." Sometimes it's Jalal, sometimes it's Jamal. So that ethos, I think, has to be urgently reclaimed. Otherwise, we'll just sink into the same kind of anxiety and depression that everybody else in the West seems to be sinking into. We need to have that joy. Islam, basically a religion of love, optimism, no doctrine of original sin, joy in our wives, joy in our families and our children, in the miracle of creation, the gift of every breath. That's how we should be. And I think that's also how, to come on to the second half of your question, we need to indigenize ourselves, or more precisely, to recognize that we are indigenous, because the Muslim belongs everywhere. The whole earth has been made a masjid for me. The Holy Prophet says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, which means uluru, just as it means uhud. It's the same principle. It's all of God. Wherever you turn, there is God's face. So the urf question is whether we accept this idea of the omnipresence of the divine, and that we're not exiles here or anywhere, or whether we want to carry with our baggage from countries of origin certain things that remind us of places where we felt more at home. So we build mosques that look like something in Turkey or Lebanon or Iraq or Kurdistan out of a kind of wistful nostalgia, as if we kind of regret what we've done by coming to the West, rather than recognizing that we're the religion of universality and the religion of hijrah. And certainly in the United Kingdom, most mosques are still being built in styles that reflect that kind of unhappiness and nostalgia. They don't look like the buildings of a happy community, but the buildings of a bunch of exiles and foreigners who really kind of don't feel they belong and would rather they were elsewhere. And this is a major stimulus to the public sense that Islam doesn't belong, that it's foreign, that we couldn't possibly join it because it wants to be foreign, and that it can't really respect what's local. So mosques that, and we see the new generation of mosques starting to do this, actually respect the local and use local traditions, immediately open up the door to da'wah, and people walk in, they feel respected, they feel honored. And the mosques are just as Sharia compliant as any other mosque. You don't need to have a pointy dome and pointy windows for a building to be a mosque. That's just the urf of certain Islamic countries. So to the extent that we're nostalgics and sorrowful and feel uncomfortable, the religion will not transmit itself to the new generation and will wither. To the extent that we are confident people who build according to local styles, respectfully of the local urf, we'll find that people come in. So our local mosque in Cambridge, for instance, which is built in various ways according to what the architect took to be a British style of building, they average a shahada every 5 days now in the mosque. And that's even when things are still quiet because of COVID. People are longing to come into Islam once it's properly explained to them, but they have, the foreignness of it has to be taken away. Whatever it might be, the Bangladeshiness, the Kurdishness, the Bosnianness, people can make the jump into a new religion. Making the jump into a new culture is going to be an added burden that they probably can't carry. So I think the future of Islam in the West has to be this indigenization, which in the Australian context, I guess, would probably mean looking at some of those wonderful, very spiritual, abstract Aboriginal art patterns and making them the center of the design of the new generation of masjids. That's respectful. That shows that you're an Australian community, and it will certainly open up the doors to adherence by the new generation and to newcomers to the faith, inshallah.
Thank you, Sheikh. And I know that there are quite a few questions that I've been told, which I actually didn't realize that time is up, brothers and sisters. And Sheikh, thank you so much. Were there any final comments or thoughts you wanted to leave us with before we do a thank you to you? A final thank you?
Well, thanks to everybody for this amazing initiative. I've had the privilege of visiting Australia on several occasions, and it was nice to see the warm welcome. I was allowed to give the khutbah at the mosque in Bankstown once. Some of the older generation looked a bit doubtful, but they were very, very forgiving. And alhamdulillah, just to pray for you for tawfiq, to help you feel that you do indeed belong. The Muslims belong more than anybody belongs, really, from God's perspective, and to work to building up your neighbors, supporting your neighbors, showing the beauty of Islam, unveiling the beauty of our wonderful religion, overcoming fearfulness, and ultimately having trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, remembering that ours is a religion of tawakkul, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is still in charge of history. and that we shouldn't be anxious and shouldn't be pessimistic, inshallah.
That's on beautiful notes. Thank you very much, Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you and your health. And thank you for this illuminating conversation. And if I could say, may this book and your works continue to shape the masses as meta-citizens with that higher reciprocity and healers. And if anyone is intrigued by those concepts, here I actually plug in his book, Traveling Home, with my notes over here. You're welcome to get it. I think it's available online and on various platforms. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, brothers and sisters, for this opportunity.